Okay, everybody, welcome back to Psychology. Today we're going to be discussing Unit 3A, which will cover neural processing and the endocrine system. So first we should talk about biopsychology. Biopsychology is the study of the interaction between biology, behavior, and the environment. Biopsychology links biology and behavior, and it has its roots in phrenology. Phrenology was created by Franz Gall, which is somebody we're going to talk about later. Phrenologists believe that bumps on the skull determine mental capacity and personality traits. We know phrenology is a false science now, but it did bring up the idea that regions of the brain serve specific purposes. So when we're talking about the brain and its how it works, how it processes neural information, we want to talk about glial cells. Glial cells are a type of non-neuron cell that are found in the nervous system. They're very small compared to neurons. There's about 10 glial cells for every one neuron, and they basically give nutrients to the neurons. They remove waste products from the neurons. They're used in making the myelin sheath, which is something we'll get into later. They help form new synapses, and they help develop the nervous system during the embryonic stage. Neurons need the help of the glial cells. They're very important to the function of neurons. Neurons themselves are individual brain cells. They're found within the nervous system, and they transmit electrical and a chemical signal to the body, allowing for brain-to-body communication. So there are certain parts of the neuron that you absolutely must know. You have the axon, the dendrite, the myelin sheath, the neurotransmitter, the soma, the synapse, and the vesicle. So let's talk about the axon. The axon is where neural impulses occur. It sends information away from the soma and to the other neurons. The axon is the longest part of the neuron. So in this diagram you see below, the axon is going to be that orange tubular thing that makes up the most of the neuron, and you can see it's kind of obstructed by those lighter yellow ovular blob type things, and those blobs are actually the myelin sheath. So then we get into the dendrite. Dendrites receive information from other neurons. As dendrites grow larger, communication between neurons will become quicker because there is less distance that needs to be traveled to get from one neuron to another. So in this diagram below, you can see that the dendrites are those yellow branches ending in the orange circles. Those are dendrites, and you can kind of think of them as like tree roots, or if you want to think about what they look like tree roots. And that orange circle in the middle there is the soma. So, okay, now we're going to talk about the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath insulates the axon, enabling neural impulses to be sent faster down the axon. Nodes of Ranvier, which you don't really need to know, but you might be asked about it. Nodes of Ranvier are the gaps in between the myelin sheath. So in this diagram, those blue things encapsulating the red tube, that red tube is the axon, and the blue things covering it are the myelin sheath. And you can also see in the diagram that is pointing out the nodes of Ranvier as well. Okay, so now we get to neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that go across the synapse from one neuron to another. They influence whether or not an action potential will occur. So in this diagram you see the neurotransmitters are those yellow triangle looking things, and that empty space that they're traveling across is actually the synapse. So now we get to the soma. The soma is also called the cell body, and it contains the nucleus of the neuron. Now to the synapse. Synapses are gaps in between neurons. Axons send messages over the synapse to a receiving dendrite. So vesicles, now we get to vesicles. Vesicles are containers that hold neurotransmitters being sent across the synapse. So I like to think of vesicles as like vessels or vehicles, or like a combination of those words, because they're vessels or vehicles in which the neurotransmitters can travel across the synapse. So let's review the interaction of neurons. A message is received by a receiving dendrite. This message is passed through the soma and down the axon. This message is then released from the axon. It's usually at a location called the axon terminal or the axon buttons, and it is sent across the synapse. The message is then received by another neuron receiving dendrites, and the process continues. So we've just seen a brief overview of how neurons communicate, but what exactly is going on? Well, we have to talk about a neural impulse then. A neural impulse is a signal that moves through one neuron to another. Neural impulses require energy to be sent, and they occur in steps. So step 1 is resting potential, step 2 is depolarization, step 3 is the threshold, step 4 is the action potential, and step 5 is the absolute refractory period. So, when a neuron is at rest, positively and negatively charged ions are moving in and out of the cell body at different rates. This difference in flow results in there being more negative ions in the cell body. When a cell body is at a negative 70 charge, it is said to be at resting potential. The neuron is inactive. Neurons are only able to fire an action potential when the soma is in rest. So the soma has to be at that negative 70 charge. The dendrites of a neuron at rest receive a message. Positively charged sodium begins to enter the soma, and it depolarizes the neuron. And this is the depolarization step. The threshold is the minimum amount of stimulation necessary to cause an action potential within a neuron. You do not need to know the specific threshold number, you just need to know what a threshold is. When the charge of the cell body exceeds the threshold, the neuron fires, i.e. an action potential occurs. The action potential is the signal or message being sent. It's how neurons communicate. When the charge of the cell body exceeds the threshold, an electrical charge is sent down the axon, and based on this electrical charge, neurotransmitters are sent across the synapse to the intended neuron's dendrites. The electrical charge is called the action potential. After an action potential is sent, the cell membrane of the soma closes. The neuron cannot send another action potential until the cell membrane opens back up. The period of time where the cell membrane is closed is called the absolute refractory period. Once the cell membrane opens back up, the neuron must get back to the negative 70 charge. The all or none potential isn't a step in the action. It isn't a step in a neuron firing. It's just an idea that you need to know. All or none potential is the idea that a neuron fires with the same intensity each time. So it doesn't matter if it exceeds the threshold by a lot or by a little. It will fire the action potential with the same intensity each time. You can think about it as if you're shooting a gun, right? No matter how hard you pull the trigger, the bullet is going to travel at the same speed every time. Then we get into repolarization. After the action potential, positively charged potassium exits the body, bringing it back to the negative 70 charge it needs. Hyperpolarization doesn't always occur, but it can occur because too much potassium leaves the body, making it too negative. This will extend the absolute refractory period because the neuron has to wait longer to get back to the negative 70 charge. There are different types of messages that the neuron can send. It can send excitatory messages or inhibitory messages. Excitatory messages increase the likelihood that the neuron will depolarize, and excitatory messages cause action potentials. Inhibitory messages increase the likelihood that the neuron will hyperpolarize and won't cause an action potential. Neurons can be categorized in two ways: presynaptic and postsynaptic. Presynaptic neurons send the neurotransmitters, and postsynaptic neurons receive the neurotransmitter. Reuptake occurs when the presynaptic neuron absorbs unused neurotransmitters. Research has shown that those with depression brought on by a chemical imbalance in the brain are experiencing a reuptake of serotonin. Thus, they are prescribed SSRIs, which stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So now we get to the concept of the blood-brain barrier. Not all messages enter the brain via the body, so there must be a postsynaptic neuron receptor matching the substance trying to enter the brain, thus protecting the brain from potentially harmful substances. So now we get into the nervous systems, and This will seem a little bit confusing at first, but you just have to get some practice with it, and you're probably going to have to do some memorizing as well. So there are several different nervous systems and subsystems in the body. There's the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. In the central nervous system, there's a different type of neuron called the interneuron, which only travels and communicates within the central nervous system. One track of interneurons moves up the spine and the other moves down. So the peripheral nervous system consists of everything that isn't the brain or the spine. The peripheral nervous system connects the body to the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is broken into two parts, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is a subset of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movements, like raising your hand, scratching an itch, exercising, all those types of things. The autonomic nervous system is a subset of the peripheral nervous system. It controls all involuntary movements, like your heart beating, your breathing, your blinking. You can think of it as autonomic equals automatic. The autonomic nervous system is split up into two other nervous systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system speeds up the body. It makes your heart rate faster and other things like this. You can see in the diagram it also constricts the pupil. I was looking at the wrong one. It dilates the pupil and it inhibits saliva production and all the other things that are listed there. The parasympathetic nervous system calms the body down or slows down your heart rate. Like it constricts your pupils, it increases saliva production, and it reduces your heart rate. So neural chains are how the brain communicates with the body. A neural chain consists of sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are neurons that travel within the peripheral nervous system, and sensory neurons send messages to the central nervous system. Motor neurons are neurons that travel within the peripheral nervous system. Motor neurons carry messages out to the body to create movement. As I mentioned before, interneurons only travel and communicate within the CNS, the central nervous system. So, an example of a neural chain at work, because this stuff can be confusing when it's the first time learning it. So, let's say you put your hand on a hot stove. Sensory neurons going from your hand to your spine give a message to the interneurons that your hand is currently touching a hot stove, messages of heat, texture, etc. Interneurons going from the spine to the brain give this message to the brain where it is processed. The brain determines that you should move your hand away from the stove. Your brain sends this message back down to your spine via interneurons. The interneurons give this message to the motor neurons, which go out from the spine to your hands. The motor neurons in your hands receive this message and you pull your hands away quickly. And remember, when these neurons are communicating, they each have to go through the resting potential, depolarization, threshold, action potential, and absolute refractory period. And this all happens within a matter of milliseconds. Think about if you put your hand on a hot stove, how fast you would take it away. So this happens very, very quickly. So nerves are neural cables comprised of just axons that are part of the peripheral nervous system. Nerves enable communication with the central nervous system. Nerves are really just a bundle of axons, but there are two types of nerves you need to know: afferent nerves and efferent nerves. Afferent nerves carry information to the central nervous system. Sensory neurons are within afferent nerves. Efferent nerves carry information from the central nervous system out to the body. Motor neurons are within efferent nerves. So here's more on neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that send neural messages across the synapse. There are 6 neurotransmitters you need to know: acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that allows for muscle action, learning, and memory. Not enough acetylcholine can result in Alzheimer's or a lack of acetylcholine in the brain or something like that. If there's not enough acetylcholine being produced, you can develop Alzheimer's. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. If you have too much dopamine being produced in your brain, you can come down with schizophrenia. And if you have a lack of dopamine in your brain, you can develop the tremors that are associated with Parkinson's disease. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that influences mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. If you have a lack of serotonin in your brain, you can develop depression. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that controls alertness and arousal. If you have a lack of norepinephrine in your brain, you can have a depressed mood. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. If you have a lack of GABA in your brain, you can experience insomnia, tremors, and seizures. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter and is also involved in memory. Too much glutamate can cause migraines or seizures. So there's certain drugs that can affect neurotransmitters. So there's antagonistic drugs which mimic the neurotransmitters and are prescribed when there's an undersupply of the neurotransmitter in the brain. So like I was saying earlier, if you have a lack of acetylcholine being produced in your brain, you could develop Alzheimer's. You might be prescribed something that mimics acetylcholine to try to prevent as much as possible the progression of that disease. And then there's antagonistic drugs which block the neurotransmitter from being delivered. So this is prescribed when there's an oversupply of the neurotransmitter in the brain. So like I was saying earlier, too much dopamine being produced in the brain can cause schizophrenia, so you might be prescribed some sort of antagonistic drug for that. So now we get into the endocrine system. The endocrine system is another communication system similar to the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. However, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system use electricity to deliver messages, whereas the endocrine system uses the bloodstream. This makes it slower, relatively slower than the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but it makes it slower, like it communicates within seconds, whereas the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system communicates within milliseconds. So the endocrine system communicates through glands which produce hormones that circulate in the blood. So important parts of the endocrine system which you need to know: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, and the pineal gland. The hypothalamus is a structure in the brain that connects the brain to the endocrine system by controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the gland that controls all other glands. The thyroid gland influences metabolism. The adrenal gland triggers the fight or flight response. The pineal gland regulates sleep with melatonin. And it looks like that is the end of Psychology Unit 3A. So I'll see you all next time.